Thank you for joining my talk on the SaaS-y side of incident response. Like everyone else that does cloud-based incident response, you have to have SaaS-y in the term. I thought I was unique, and then I started looking around, and I'm not as unique as I thought with that title. But who am I? So I am Cody Craig. I'm a principal incident responder at Mitiga. My hobby is golf for the most part. We're a pretty high stress job. I thought I would pick up a hobby that would be outside, low stress, something fun to do. I hear some chuckles. You must be a high handicap like me and know that that's not as low stress as I thought it would be. In the middle there, I have my cutest coworker. That's my dog named Birdie. Birdie for golf, of course. If you're listening and you work with me, I apologize. I'm not saying you're not cute, but come on, look at that photo. I mean, you're not half as cute. I saw that there's a Slack channel for pet lovers. I love that channel right now. So keep those coming. The last thing I'll say about me before we get into it is on the top right there. So funny that my first love was storm chasing. My first career was actually in teaching. I was a teacher and a football coach. And whenever I had a chance to talk in front of a decent crowd, I like to just put it out there that if you're moving from a different career or young in your career, or you're thinking about transitioning into forensics, like it might be like me and maybe think that you didn't belong at first, or how would you actually make that switch over, or how do you even do that? My LinkedIn is there in the bottom if you're having those thoughts or just want to talk about how to get into cyber or make a career change or something like that. Please reach out. I had some great mentors help me along the way, so if I can help out in any ways, just shoot me a connection. I'd love to help. So introduction, that's what we're doing right now. The problems, which I'll get into, there's two main problems, and I want us to think of these problems not so much a problem with what I'm going to show, but a problem with the way that we think about how to handle SaaS and incident response. As investigators, as threat hunters, there's a change in the way that you need to think about how addressing certain logs when you're faced with them, and a change in your mindset in general. To do that, I'm going to show two examples. And those two examples are going to be two different log vendors. Not an attack on those log vendors. I'm not saying that those are bad examples or bad logs by any way. I'm just saying that for us, we need to think about how we handle certain logs, right? And then in a conclusion. In that, I'm going to have a few aspects to the conclusion. One will be telling you some things that you can do to move forward with those examples. One's a more holistic approach overall if you're doing any type of cloud or SaaS-based incident response or threat hunting. And then I have a little bit of a surprise, something to maybe give out to people at the very end also. So a few steps to that. So what is the problem, right? So the problem that we face is going to be in two main things, right? So it's going to be in log documentation and log health. So log documentation, I want you to think about this. I want you to think that you're going to do some type of threat hunting or incident response engagement. You get pulled in and it's a log that you've never even heard of, never done anything with, never done any type of analysis with it at all. Okay, can you Google that log and start your analysis based on what you're seeing in that log documentation? You don't need to do anything else, right? You can pull that documentation up. You see one-to-one events, you see schemas, you see everything you need to know to do your actual analysis. Log health, I want you to think of if you see that someone, there's an event that says someone logged in, that person actually logged in, right? I don't want to see an event that says somebody logged in and they actually did not, right? So that's what I want you to think about with log health. Something I'm not going to really talk about is the retention and availability. For the most part, that's very well documented, and if it's not documented, you can reach out to your vendor and they'll have that answer for you pretty quick. If you have these logs streaming somewhere, it's like a SIM, you also probably know how long you keep those logs with you. Those two icons there, the log documentation and log health, when you see the rest of these slides, there's going to be color coding with them. I want you to think of it like a stoplight, right? So red, if you see red as an investigator, as a threat hunter, whatever it might be, you really need to be cautious and go ahead and stop what you're doing and think about that log and say, do I have everything I need to actually make good judgments, right? Have I looked at every single possible piece of documentation I have? Do I have my own documentation? Have I tested it out? I need to take a really stop and think, right? If it's yellow, you probably don't have to stop everything you're doing, but you should be aware that there are some pitfalls and maybe some limitations to you as you're doing that analysis that you might just want to be aware of. So yeah, keep those in mind. If you see red and yellow, that's kind of what I want you to think about there. So I like to think of things as scenarios, and I like to talk about things as scenarios. So the first scenario I'm going to give you is you're working GitHub, and you know this threat actor, they gained credentials to your identity provider. This identity provider then, or that identity provider provision access into GitHub, and you're trying to do an investigation on that GitHub side. Right, so I think it's the Hunt Evil poster. It talks about source and destination, right? So if you're doing RDP analysis on Windows, you have that source artifact event logs, and then you want to match it up with these destination artifact event logs, right? So then you can start seeing that session on that remote, on that destination. So same thing here. You know that you have that source, that identity provider says that there is a single sign-on to GitHub. Now you're working in GitHub, and you're wanting to see that destination and start tracking that session there. Okay. So what do? First thing that I do is I just Google. What is GitHub event logs, GitHub audit logs? What do I have in GitHub to actually see this type of activity? If you're going to do that Google, if you're going to do that search, the first thing that you're probably going to see is a list of event names with the audit log, and also a sample of what is contained in that field, in that event, right? So like you see here, I know that, org SSO response sounds pretty promising. I have a nice little blurb there. It's like, it's not available to web interface. Okay, well, that's nice. I don't need to hunt for this in the web interface. I need to go look somewhere else. Hopefully I'm actually streaming with that. And then I have some keys and example values over here, right? So what are we doing? We say, all right, let's go ahead and search in our SIM or wherever we're streaming these logs. Let's look for this event. And I'm probably going to look for data.email. That'd probably be a good starting point here to see if I have anything that I can start correlating with on my left hand, on my source side. So let's do that. So we look at it and we have some bit of an issue maybe, or some like confusion that we might have when we're doing this, because on the right hand side there, I have a sample of the org SSO response. And to be fair, if you're exporting these logs off, you will see an email field there, but it's empty. Right, so that empty field really doesn't do me much good. But I have this like different field here called external name ID, identity name ID, external identity username. Both of those look pretty good. I'm starting to think like, okay, maybe this is something that I can pivot off of to see what else happened with this user. Our problem is though, is where is that actually at? Right, so as investigators, and you probably have this like investigative mindset of questioning everything, you might start having this snowball effect, or like start going down these rabbit holes of every event that I see now, I need to know what is actually there. So if you think about it as an investigation or a threat hunt, if you start searching for this user at acme.com in this external identity name ID, do we know if that field is in every other event name? Probably not, right? So how do you like actually get past doing that? So what I probably would end up doing is I'd probably start taking note of every single event I have and saying, all right, I have this one, I have this one, I have this one, I don't have this one. Let me now search for the next event. Maybe it's like a clone action. And I say, all right, well, I have this one, I have this one, I don't have this one over here, right? So if you're doing that in an investigation, you're losing pretty precious time, right? You're trying to figure out what's happening. Things are happening quick. You're having to take a whole step back and starting to build out your idea of what I can actually do to search in my SIM. What can I actually do to see my whole scope? Can I see this, doing these actions? Do I know what's actually happening here? All right. So that's why I have this as red, right? So if you see yourself in these situations, right, and you you're trying to figure out what's happening, you probably should take a full step back and make sure that you've looked at every single thing you can look at for this log source. In this example is GitHub. Make sure that you've scoured the internet for it. Make sure that I've looked for this external name ID. Maybe there's documentation elsewhere and it's not in that first thing that popped up in Google, right? And so it's exactly what I would do here. And so as you see, like it is documented, right? It's just not in that place that you might think or might assume that you would normally see the documentation, hence my sad logs there. I love the GPT. I'm not a graphic designer, but I can do that within 2 prompts. It's pretty great, right? So yeah, so I'm looking for it and I see that there's release notes, right? And I see that, there's things out there that I can start using to start building my documentation, or I can start building my threat hunt, or I can start building my investigation. The last thing that you want to do is just assume, right? And like I hate that word assume being in incident response and having to write reports. Like assuming is like is a no-no, right? So the worst thing that we can do is assume that this field is there for every event and search for that, because you're going to have, false negatives. You're going to say, well, they didn't do anything related to Git because I don't see that email there, or they didn't log in, they didn't create a access token, they didn't authenticate with an access token because I don't see that there. You really need to go and see what is actually in every single one of those events, every single one of those fields before you make that type of justification. Okay? All right, so think about that, keep that in the back of your head. We'll come back to that, later on when I talk about the conclusions. I'm not just going to leave you on a cliffhanger there. But let's talk about a different scenario here. So Okta. So you have we can just say it's a nation state, right? I think the first talk we had yesterday, they were talking about nation state actors and how persistent they were. So we can think about that here. And we have this nation state. They log in to authenticate to Okta. They don't want to use that account anymore. So they reset the factors for somebody else. That then sends an email out saying, hey, all these factors are reset. So I'm not going to go into that much more right now. I just want you to think, how would you start investigating that? What kind of logs would you look for? What fields would you think about? How would you find that full scope into understanding what's actually going on with this? Before we get there, so Okta in general, like it is really nice with the API calls, event names. Like I think the documentations is pretty solid. If you've had a chance to look at the system logs there, and you'll see that even they have older event names as a column, which is really nice because you can then look at error message, error codes, the newer event, the older event, and sometimes the terminology there gives you a little more insight into what's going on instead of just using one or the other. So that's pretty great. The improvement that I've noticed, or something that I've noticed that can trip up investigations or threat hunts, would be the event fields. And really, when I say that, I don't mean all of the event fields. I mean just one in particular. It's the debug context field. If you've had any type of investigation in Okta, you've probably seen this field that has lots of different things in there that you think you can use. Before I get to that, there is a disclaimer when you look at the documentation, as we talked about, with Okta, and they're saying that, hey, I know this field is there. It's mostly for debugging purposes. Pretty much, use at your own risk at that point. So think about how that can, hinder, or that can cause you some caution with an investigation. There's pretty much three things that can happen. One, you don't look at the documentation beforehand. You don't look at this, and you're looking at these Okta logs, and you're taking this debug context field for truth, right? It could lead to some judgment mishaps. It could lead to false positives, false negatives, whatever you want to lead to. It could lead you down the wrong path if you don't see that. Two, you see this field and you say, I don't really trust it. I don't want to use it. Probably could get away with some stuff there, but as we'll see here in the next few slides, it has some really nice information that I think that would be helpful for an investigation. And three, which is the one that we're going to kind of work on right now, is you look at it and you kind of take it with a grain of salt, and you start doing your investigations, you do your testing and say, what can I actually use out of this to be useful for me? Can I use this for further scoping? Can I use this to correlate events, right? And so let's look at this debug context field here. So we have a few different parts of that on the screen. Probably one of my favorite that I like using is the factor. So if you're writing detections, or if you're looking at, like, just say MFA fatigue attacks, you can see that, a bunch of failed authentications, and you can see that factor might be, the push or the code or whatever that might be. Before that, you can see the factor, and you can see like password. So if you see someone that has a factor of password, there's a success, and then you see factor of push, and you see a bunch of fails. I could tell you that, hey, they're not in, but they probably had this password, and I should go reset those credentials, right? So in that itself, it does have value, right? So just skipping over it would be an issue. But also, as we see in the behaviors one, the second one down there, you have something that I've seen a lot is where you have don't have a new state, You don't have a new city, you don't have a new device, you don't have a new IP address, but you have a new country, right? So it's kind of just like, I don't know how that makes sense, right? So that would be something that if you're writing detections or if you're doing your filters based on that one part, you would then run into, again, those, false positives, false negatives, bad detections, and you probably shouldn't use that. With that being said, there are different things in those Okta logs, like they break out where the city you're at, the state, they break out the ASN, they break out a bunch of other stuff in other fields. So there is things that you can do outside of looking at that one behaviors field. But if you're not doing your own documentation, your own health checks, it could cause you some issues when you're doing that type of investigation. I find myself wanting to look at this like screen the whole time. I was like telling myself, I was like, these graphics are so cool. I'm not gonna look back at it every time, but I'm having a really hard time right now. So let's go back to this scenario, right? So we have this nation threat actor. They reset MFA devices, and we want to find out where this password or this email reset went. Where did this email get sent to? Okay, so if you're not too familiar with the documentation, or if you haven't done your health checks, you haven't done all this pre-work before this, you might look at this target here, and I know it's probably kind of small, but there's a target there, and you can see that this is the target of this MFA reset or this factor reset. You could assume, there's that word again, assume. You could assume that's where it's going, right? But if you are doing that, then that would be probably not the right thing to do. You probably should do some testing. You probably should look for further documentation, because actually there is fields in that debug context that you can correlate with other fields in the debug context to match up events, right? So in this situation, that password or that MFA reset email is sent by the system. And there's a field there called the email request ID that you can match up with the request ID in the previous debug context field. You can also do this with transaction IDs. And there's also another scenario or another thing that you can do is if you have, anyone remember like if I reset my password or have something suspicious, Okta will send you a, hey, did you do this email? So when that happens and you say yes or no, that activity is also tracked in transaction IDs. That is documented by Okta, right? So you can follow that whole workflow by them. So, right, so there are things that you can use in this debug context field, in these transaction IDs that would be beneficial for you, right? So just taking it and not using it or not being sure what you actually did there, both of those are equally, not as good, not something we really want to do here. Okay, so I know that I went through that kind of quick. So we have both things here. We have log health and we have log documentation. We've seen two examples there of things that could help us or not, hinder us, could be false positives, false negatives, whatever it might be, some things that we should keep in mind. So GitHub, going back to that first scenario that we had, there's a few things that you can do to overcome that. One, the first thing is you want to have these logs going into some centralized locations, so going into some SIM. They mentioned that you can only search with certain factors if you do it in the UI. You saw there that the org SSO response is not part of the UI. There's also like API events. There's many other things that you could have there that you can't actually search for or they don't have in the UI. So it brings it back to that documentation. We want the documentation green, right? So we want to know what those things are before we move into it. You want to leverage the various fields together, right? So we talked about that first scenario. We talked about like tracking these sessions once they got to GitHub. So in order to do that, you need to know what each field and how they map to the other ones, right? So for example, like in Git events, if you have a token, and then if you have org SSO, you have an email, and then you have, maybe they log in with a username and password. You need to see how each of those play together so you can start tracking those sessions. And the only way to do that is to get into those logs and make that hypothesis and start seeing what actually happens there. And then the last thing is like using the IP addresses would be a great way to do it. If you don't have that configured, make sure you configure it. But using that along with other normal behavior and understanding how those fields are puts you in a pretty good spot to handle that type of situation. There's a little teaser here in the bottom right of something I want to get to here in a little bit. But start taking note of that. We talked about in that first GitHub scenario that if you have to go through each event and start documenting it, one event might take you 5 minutes. Now you have 10 minutes. Now you have 15 minutes. If you have to do that for one incident response or one threat hunt, maybe it takes what, an hour to 2 hours out of your time. But if you have to do that again and you didn't document it, you're going to start kicking yourself. Or if your teammate has to go do that and you didn't document it, now you're just losing extra time on top of that, right? So having something as simple as like, here's this field, here's what the description is, and here's how it's useful for my investigation will take you wonders, because then you can match up that with the actual vendor documentation and feel confident in what you're looking at. And that's what we want, right? We want to be confident in our analysis. We want to be confident in what we're looking at. We don't want to be worried that we're misrepresenting something. For Okta, and I kind of just mentioned it also with a different scenario with the suspicious email, using a combination of the transaction IDs along with the various different debug context IDs and the authentication context IDs. So all these are different ones that are broken out there. If you're doing some type of search and you're taking one of those IDs and just doing a raw search in your SIM or a raw search for anything in there, you will start seeing where each one of these are and how they're correlated. If you're familiar with like Enter ID and they have like correlation ID that takes the, your entire like authentication chain all the way through and seeing what those happen, it's something similar there, right? But if you're only searching for it in one of those fields, you're going to miss the other items there, right? And so like if we go back to that scenario, that email was actually sent to a Proton email address. If we miss that, we miss an entire indicator that we can search for in our seg. We can, block it. We can see if they're trying to do any other types of probes. It's just an indicator that we missed, right? So doing those raw log searches would do wonders for you. So I'm going to use Salesforce here as an example. I am not affiliated with them at all. I'm not saying that they're the best in the world for documentation, but if you're doing your own documentation, which is something that I think you should be doing in some sort of Confluence or Wiki or something that you're doing for your team, this would be a great way to go and start doing it, right? So with that Salesforce documentation, they have all their events. And in those events, they had every schema for that event, right? And then in those schemas, they have examples in those schemas, right? So not only that, so you can go, and if we think back to that, GitHub scenario we had, we could say, all right, well, I know org SSO response has these 8 fields, and I know git clone has these 5 fields. I can match these 2 together, and I can start seeing a correlation, right? The only way you get to there is if you start doing something like this, right? So like the login type there, you could take it and say, copy it. If I was doing this, I'd copy all this to my shared resource. I would start looking at logins for Salesforce, and I would say, all right, well, that looks good. If I look at the possible value of S, doesn't look like it's working right, I'm gonna take a note of it so we don't use it. If I look at possible value of Z, it looks like that's working, I'm gonna take note of it so I can trust it, right? So there is some work on your end that you need to be aware of to do this. And so I wanna come to that like holistic approach and not just talk about, Okta and GitHub right now, because those were like 2 examples, but it's not everything, it's not just about them, right? It's about SaaS and cloud logs in general. There was a talk yesterday, right, that was about the new Microsoft API that you might not be logging, right? It's another, that was another great example because these APIs and updates to these logs and release notes come out all the time, right? So you have to stay on top of it to know what you're actually looking at. And so when we're doing that, we're not relying on assumptions. We're not relying on things that look like they should be, but they're not. So a lot of times, if you see something in a log and you haven't done the research on it, you're going to associate that with something you're familiar with. All right, so something like a pitfall that I fell into when I was first looking at GitHub is I was looking at actor, and it was just like, all right, well, I know actor and other logs is an email address, like this should be an email address. When really it's not, right? It's just your GitHub username. And so there's no connection to the actual email associated with that unless you found something like an org SSO response, right? Assuming the log health, we saw how that can be detrimental. Something easy to do with that is just do your own testing, right? Go in there, simulate an MFA fatigue, simulate a password reset email, do all that stuff and see what's actually looking good for that and what you can actually trust in your investigations. Not relying on documentation. All right. So I say that, half-heartedly, I guess, like you need to have that vendor documentation as a starting point. But as we saw with like the GitHub example, and even with that second example I gave with Okta to where it sends that suspicious email and you can track it and they have that documentation, scour the internet for it. It's probably there somewhere, right? Whether it's in release notes, it's in a forum, it's probably there somewhere if you're seeing it in your log. And if not, then great, then you make it yourself, right? But if you just go off that first level, you're probably not going to see everything that you need to see there. As we, those release notes with GitHub, it was a great example because we saw that there's actually blogs for both of those that I gave. So there's two little samples that I gave, or just the release note portion. There was blogs that they wrote for each of those and how you can actually use it in your searches and in your investigation. Okay. And so moving forward, we need to be proactive, right? So this is another like teaser of what I want to show here in this next slide, but it's take each log source that you have in your environment and you need to start seeing what you can actually investigate for it. I can't tell you how many times I've been in investigations where something's been compromised and you get into that log and you find out that there's actually no forensic value in that log at all. Right. So how do you answer those questions about what happened if those logs actually don't have any forensic value? It's easier, in my opinion, to have that conversation with your CISO or with your incident response manager now instead of when you actually need to use that log, because that conversation is not fun when they're looking at you for answers and you come back with them like, hey, I'm sorry, I have nothing that I can give you here. This log has like 2 lines, right? So go everything that you're having logged, make sure you have a chance to go and actually do those, hypothesis and document it for the future use. And last thing, so when I was asked for my fun fact and I said storm chaser, that was after I already had this thing created. Okay, so I think it's just like kind of poetic that it happened in that sense. But what my team has done is we've practiced that exact thing, and what we've done is gone through. I think we have like 12 different log sources, SaaS log sources, and broken out the fields that we find are important for an incident response. And also in some of these, I've even put in like, here's what you can do for this, and here's your pitfalls, right? And I think this would be a great way for you to take it and use it as a starting point for your own documentation, right? Take this, and I have a lot of them. So I think there's a 15-minute or 15-minute break after I'm done here. I have a lot of these posters to give out. I'd love to give every one of them out. It's something that has helped me. I love the SANS posters. I've lived by the SANS posters, so having a chance to actually make my own that hopefully helps someone else was something that I really wanted to do. But we went through all these logs on here in a first iteration and tried to make it to where you can use this and feel confident about what you're actually looking at. I'm looking forward to in the future, having this available on the web, expanding it out because there's tons of different SaaS logs, obviously more than 12 or 13. But hopefully you can use this as a building block for your company and your own investigations and threat hunts going forward. So I know we have time for questions. I think I have like 7 minutes or so, but after the questions, I'll be out. Come see me, come get a poster. I can't take them all back. They're too heavy, so please take them. But yeah, that's all I have. I appreciate your attention, and I guess we have time for questions.